Hey, my name is Roman with Maderico Woodworks, and today I'm going to show you how I made a walnut dining table with a custom base. I began by cutting down the 3.5-inch flat bar into all the pieces that I would need to create the outer and inner structure of the legs. Now I don't really have all the proper metalworking tools, so what I did was use a metal cutoff blade, a square, and a clamp to try and get straight cuts for all my pieces. After I had my first piece cut down for that measurement, I used that as my template to speed up the process. In total, I had about 9 different sizes with different quantities for each size, so I try to stay as organized as possible. Now I am by no means a welder, but I wanted to try this just to see what I was capable of. So I went ahead and made a template of what the leg shape should be to try to minimize any variation that could happen from piece to piece. I figured starting off with these 90-degree corners would be my best bet, so then I could build around using the angles made by the frame to keep everything in line. For these parts, I used an 8-inch and a 2-inch piece of flat bar from my stack of cutoffs. I just put a couple tack welds on each piece just to make sure everything held in while I made the whole frame. After which I'll come back and put full beads on everything just to make sure everything's nice and strong. The next piece I added on was the biggest one, about 15.5 inches. Same thing here, just add in a couple tack welds to make sure it holds and keep moving on. Now this next piece measures about 11.25, but I had some difficulty placing it. I measured a couple times to make sure my gapping was correct in between each piece, then tacked them in. I used a scrap piece of wood in between the two larger pieces to force them to the template sides. Next up was this 2-inch piece that would connect the two 11-inch pieces together. Now the top part of the structure had about a 1/2-inch rise to it coming off of the 15-inch pieces, so I figured attaching them beforehand would be a better idea. Being that this piece was a little bit smaller, I used a right angle magnet to help me hold it down while I tacked in both sides. Once it was ready, I placed it in position, added a couple tack welds, and my frame was now complete. Now that my basic structure was complete, I had to go back in and fully weld every single joint, inside and out. This might seem like overkill, but I figured I could use the practice and it would only make the frame stronger. Now I didn't mention this before, but I'm using a flux core welder. It tends to not be the cleanest when welding. There's a lot of spatter that comes off, so I'm using an anti-spatter spray to help me keep the piece clean and save me a little bit of time in the grinding process. Next up was to create the inner structure of the legs. The structure was comprised of 5 pieces: a 1-inch, 2-inch, 5-inch, 9.25-inch, and a 12-inch piece. Making this template beforehand not only helped me speed up the process, but also helped me make sure that every part that was coming out was similar to the previous one. Time to repeat the process. I applied full welds on every single joint of these inner structures, making sure everything's nice and strong. Let me know what you guys think about my welding skills down below. Now that the individual parts were all welded, it was time to assemble the whole half of the leg. I used the template to place each part where it should be, then double check the measurements with the design to make sure I was on track. I ended up adding a couple of supports between the main structure and the inner structure to hold everything in place while I marked out the sheet metal, which would give rigidity to the whole piece. Bringing the structure over to the sheet metal, I measured and clamped it in place to make sure everything was correct to the design. Then I just traced the outside and inside with a black Sharpie. Now my plan was to cut the sheet metal using a jigsaw, but it was going to be tough in the corners, so I used a 1/2-inch drill bit to give me start and stop points. Now with the jigsaw, I tried to stay as close to the line as I could, just to avoid any grinding work later on. Next time I do a table base this intricate, I'll definitely be outsourcing this part to somebody that has a plasma CNC, just to save me some time. Now it was time to box in the frame. I placed the structure on top of the sheet metal that I just cut, clamping it down to make sure that there was solid contact between the sheet metal and the frame, and measuring to make sure nothing got out of whack. Then I added a couple more clamps. These helped create a better contact between the sheet metal and the structure and helped keep the parts from moving while I was working on them. Being that the sheet metal was a little bit thinner gauged, I put a lot more tack welds to hold everything in place without adding too much heat to the whole piece. And now we finally get a first look at the leg. Now this is just half of the leg. The other half will be inverted on top of this piece, being held together by bolts. Now the other side has to be enclosed as well, but it's basically the same process, so I'm not gonna bore you with that. Next up was to put full welds on everything. I went back to the anti-spatter spray just to keep everything nice and clean while I fully welded all the way around. Now this is the part most people hate, but I thought it was kind of cool how I was able to take my welds down to nice smooth transitions in between all the pieces. Now it definitely took some time, but same as when you're sanding a tabletop, it's all worth it in the end. Now that the legs were far enough along, I was able to turn my focus onto the tabletop. I picked these boards up from a local lumberyard. Each one was about 9 feet long, and some even measured a foot wide. So I definitely paid a pretty penny for these, especially with today's lumber prices, but when you see the final product, it's completely worth it. These boards were S3S, so I cut them down to 8 inches wide to give me a 40-inch total tabletop width. After placing them in a pattern that I liked, I put a couple clamps on to keep them tight while I marked for the biscuits. Now I'm using a square and a straight edge, so I can reference the edge of the table to keep all my biscuits in line. Now I know a lot of people like to use a domino joiner, and that's a great option, but I don't have one. So, biscuits it is. Now I knew the glue up was going to be rough, so I tried to prepare as much as I could. I had clamps laid out, refilled the glue bottle, and every little accessory that I might have needed was right at my hand. And even still, it took us a while. I think the timestamp on this clip ended up at about 45 minutes, so yeah, it took some time. But after wrestling with every board, the tabletop came out better than I could have hoped. The following day I got it out of clamps and took it to a local shop that has a 52-inch belt sander. For a tabletop this size, it was a no-brainer. In 20 minutes they were able to flatten any high spots from the glue up and bring it up to 180 grit. After bringing it back, I squared up both sides of the table using the Craig AccuCut. Now I was having a little bit of an issue with the sawwood bogging down, but after a couple passes, everything came out well. Now the final measurement for the table was 96 inches. So same thing here, mark out my lines and take a couple passes with the saw. After struggling with this for a minute, I was able to flip it over so I could start working on the bottom side. I started out by marking how far the C-channel was going to begin. Then, placed the C-channel to mark out its position on the table. after which I marked out the ending points for the router. Using the router bit itself, I was able to position the straight edge so that I would run slightly outside of the line. It took me a couple passes, but I was able to get down as far as I needed to. Once I had all the slots cut for the C-channel, I marked my edges using a chisel so I could come back with the router and a surfacing bit to clean up the majority of the waste. Now this part isn't really necessary, but I feel it gives a better look to the C-channel when it lays flush with the bottom of the table. Now I'm not taking that deep of a cut, about 1/8 inch so that the C-channel can lay flat. But even then, this thing makes a mess, so if you have dust collection on your router, I highly suggest to use it. After the majority of the waste was out, I came back with the chisel and just cleaned up my lines. The following day I came back and marked where the threaded inserts would go. Using a 3/8 Forstner bit and some tape as my depth guide, I went ahead and drilled out all the holes. The install of the threaded inserts is pretty straightforward. Drive them in till they grab and keep going till they're flush with the wood. Now I, like many others, add a little bit of CA glue to the threaded insert before driving them in, but this isn't mandatory. Now that the C-channel was installed, I could turn my focus to the detail work. Here I'm adding a 22.5-degree bevel to the underside of the table. This is something I picked up from Cam over at Blacktail Studios, but he does it with a track saw. Since I don't have one, I figured this was the next best option. Now, it was working fine till right about here. If you look closely, you'll see that the router bit is no longer in the router. I figured I was taking too big of a cut, and the bit just couldn't hold up. So I ended up making a quick run to the big box store to pick up a bigger router and a bigger bit. I took this in a couple passes since I was already cautious about the previous attempt, and fortunately everything worked out well. Now that the underside was done, I flipped over the top and added an 1/8 inch round over to the whole piece. Here you can get a better look at what the profile of the table will be. Now the top was sanded to 180 using the belt sander, but I personally like to raise the grain before sanding to my final grit. I find that doing this allows me to get a smoother feel even when I'm sanding up to a higher grit like 320 or 400. Once the water has dried and raised up all the grain, I come back with the sander for the final pass. Now for the finish, I'm using Rubio Monocoat Pure. This is one of the easiest finishes to apply and looks great. I apply it using my sander and a white Scotch-Brite pad. I start off by spreading a little bit of the finish manually, then slowly bring up the speed on the sander. The name of the game here is to get coverage. The finish itself won't overlap on any parts that already have finish, so you won't get streaks, but you want to make sure you work it into every section of the table. After getting coverage on everything, I go ahead and do one final pass to clean up any excess finish. For the top side, it's the same process. Pour out a little bit of the finish, spread manually, then bring up the sander speed slowly. On the final cleanup pass, you can see how even the finish becomes. Now the edges being how they were, I went ahead and did it by hand just to make it easier. Once the tabletop was done, I turned my attention to the center support. Now fortunately I had enough material left over from the offcuts, so I cleaned them up to get them ready for the glue up. Now the glue up may seem a little bit weird as it's 3 boards to create 1 beam, but I had to work with what I had. And to be honest, once it came out of clamps, the joints were seamless. The main thing I focused on was getting pressure in 2 directions. A good way to know if you're achieving that is by the glue squeeze up. Now to save some time in the future, I'm cleaning up all the glue squeeze out while it's still wet. After letting the beam dry overnight, I came to the joiner to clean up 2 sides and give me a proper reference area for the planer. Now it's possible to use the table saw to square up one side, but I chose to use the planer for the 2 remaining sides because I'm able to get a smoother finish than compared to the table saw. Once it was all squared up, I added a small bevel to the ends and a larger bevel in the center section just for some added detail. After sanding and adding finish to the center beam, this was the final product.